I appreciate all of you. We're going to have a number of our colleagues joining us shortly that were at the vote. So I'm going to get started as we look back first at the 2022 election. I guess I'll ask all of you this. In your own state, which is what I believe you can address, Secretary Toulouse Oliver, do you believe that it was a secure election in 2022?
Madam Chair, yes, absolutely it was.
Okay, very good. Secretary Evnen?
Yes, Madam Chairwoman, in Nebraska, we had a secure and accurate election.
I appreciated those numbers that you put out there as well in your studies. Thank you. Mr. Knapp, South Carolina, been in your state a few times for some reason. Please let me know if you believe it was a secure election.
Yes.
Okay, very good. And Mr. Bowens in North Carolina?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Ms. Johnson, just what you saw across the country when it came to election security?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And maybe I'll start with you, Secretary Toulouse Oliver. What major issues did you see election officials in your state facing in 2022? And then get a little dig deeper on some of the things you identified. You said you listened to everyone and then came up with ideas for change. I know Secretary Simon in Minnesota, as I know, we've had a very good history of elections in our state in terms of turnout, but he still found things he could do to improve things and has introduced legislation and the like. But why don't you talk about, and already passed some things, what you see as what went well, what you wanted to improve out of 2022.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think, I don't think I'd be remiss on speaking on behalf of all of my colleagues here when I say that, when it comes to election administration, there is literally always room for improvement, no matter how successful an election we conduct, no matter how robust the participation, how well the policies and procedures were implemented. There's always room to make it better, and that is actually one of the beautiful things about the work that we do, especially as our society and our democracy evolve over time. Looking at ways to improve the process, make it more secure and more accessible is really important. So in my state, a couple of the challenges that we really sought to address in this most recent legislative session in our state, in particular, what really is effectively the weaponization of public records requests. So as several of the witnesses here today mentioned, mis and disinformation has generated a lot of threatening and harassing activity. Some of them are outright threats of violence, and that I think probably all of us have had to deal with in some form or fashion. But some of them come in the form of, we have in my state 33 counties, so not nearly as many as most of the folks up here. Some of our election offices are as small as 2 people, right? 2 full-time employees. And so when they're being bombarded with literally hundreds of requests for thousands of documents, many of which are not actually relevant to the conduct of elections or to kind of, getting to the place where the interested party wants to go, that's really challenging. So we look to try to make sure, how do we maintain documents, access to public documents, but let's make sure we're protecting the privacy of the voter or our critical national infrastructure, things like that. As well, last but not least, I'll just mention that we did pass increased penalties for threats of violence and harassment toward election officials in particular. That's a piece of legislation that I think is going to really help us moving forward with not only the sense of safety and security of our election administrators, but also in terms of that challenging issue that we're seeing with regard to hiring, retaining, and training our poll officials.
A good segue for you, Secretary Enbin. With your experience, could you talk about retaining election workforce as, you have officials choosing to retire or leave? There are issues I know you surveyed, and I mentioned the Brennan Center in some states more than others, where people are concerned about their safety because of threats, or they don't want to be on the front line like that. Could you talk about professional pathway to becoming an election officials, and just what recommendations you have when it comes to retaining election officials. Really both, we have the professional ones, and then of course we have volunteers.
Attracting and retaining election officials, there are county clerks. In many of Nebraska's counties, it's our county clerks who serve as our election commissioners as well, and some of our larger counties have dedicated election commissioners. There's certainly a heightened interest in elections, and that heightened interest extends to the county level. There are two things that I think are helpful in my state. One is when I have the opportunity, and when the deputy of elections has the opportunity to go out and speak, we find that when people become better informed about election systems, the elections process, that they leave with greater satisfaction. We also try to involve people in it. That is, we encourage people to become poll workers. We encourage people to become observers on Election Day. And what we find is that as they become more familiar with the process itself, their confidence in the integrity of the process grows. And the other observation I'd make in response to your question, Senator, is that we had very good elections in Nebraska. And I'm bragging on my state, Senator, but I'm not bragging on myself, because it's the people in those 93 counties who made that happen. And so I think it's very important, and I did so in my remarks, I think it's very important that we recognize their work and that we express appreciation and gratitude to them for it. And so that is something that I have been doing and that others have been doing as well, that I believe is helpful to encourage our election officials.
Exactly. I think that kind of some of that is defending them, I would say, if there's, attacks from people who are misinformed. Some of it is just lifting them up for what they're doing, because it's such an important part of our democracy. They're truly the front lines when people go and vote. When you were in your absence, Senator Fisher, I did bring up the Gophers Cornhuskers record. I wanted to have full disclosure. Okay, I once called her from a Gophers game when the Gophers beat Nebraska, which was a surprise, and I said I thought it was funny because I know how important. And she said it's not funny at all. I was still at the stadium. She said we could talk about it later. Okay, on that note, Mr. Knapp, if you want to talk a little bit just about, I raised this issue of, I know I've worked with Senator Graham of your state on disclosures on election bills we did together, on election ads that came about because of some of the foreign purchases of ads during one election. We've worked on social media platforms and how we police this. And I know this wasn't in your testimony. I was just thinking of Senator Graham's willingness to work on some of these issues. Could you talk a bit about how you deal with that and I don't want to get into the political realm about it. I'm just talking about making sure that your citizens are informed about what's going on with elections when they are bombarded with things that sometimes aren't true, even for the administration of elections and how and when they vote. Mr. Knapp.
That's a fantastic question, because it gives me opportunity. As Secretary Evans said, one of the weapons we have is to combat the misinformation with true information about what's going on with elections. So shortly after the 2020 election, my agency published, is on our website, basically South Carolina elections A to Z. And it talks about everything about how we keep the voter list as accurate as possible, how our voting machines work, how we do audits. And this is it was written so it could be understandable to just about anybody. And this is from us. And we also just this year started publishing an annual report to our General Assembly. I mean, that's the audience, but it's for anybody. And it just talks about what have we done this last year as an agency to administer elections in our state. So the reality is there is a segment of the population that's not going to believe anything we say, no matter what we say. And that's not who I'm speaking to. I'm speaking to the other 90% of the population that all they hear is the screaming and the misinformation. And, you know, I get it. Questioning government is an American pastime and has been since the beginning. But at some point, Americans have to decide, do you believe the election officials or not? And so this is our best shot at trying to be as transparent as possible. And that's really something I've tried to hit home during my tenure, is transparency.
Okay, thank you. I really want to ask Mr. Bowens, Ms. Johnson questions. I'm going to do that on my second round here because my colleagues are waiting. Before I go vote and turn this over briefly to Senator Fisher, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record: a new report by two nonpartisan groups, Issue 1 and the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, with 13 recommendations to improve election administration, including the reforms in the Election Worker Protection Act that I mentioned that I've introduced, a letter from the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund, and statements for the record from a bipartisan pair of county clerks about the challenges they face when running elections. Justin Robach, the Clerk and Register of Deeds for Ottawa County, Michigan, who's a Republican, and Brianna Lennon, County Clerk for Boone County, Missouri, who's a Democrat. Without objection, these documents will be entered into the record. So entered. Senator Fisher.